My name is Lena Carter. I'm 35 years old. And at 6:47 on a Wednesday evening, while standing in a dim concrete parking structure outside the hospital where I worked, I listened to a voicemail that should have shattered me. My laptop bag was still hanging from my shoulder, my blazer smelled faintly like antiseptic and stale coffee, and the echo of tires rolling over the ramp above me bounced off the concrete walls. My mother's voice came through the speaker calm, controlled, and almost rehearsed. It was the same voice she used whenever she wanted to sound reasonable in front of other people. Lena, your father, and I have talked about this. We think it's best if you stop contacting the family for a while. There was a pause that felt deliberate. Then she delivered the real sentence. We're moving forward without you. And just like that, she hung up.
No argument. No explanation.
Just a quiet dismissal, like she had closed a business meeting instead of cutting off her own daughter. I stood there staring at the gray wall of the parking structure while a car passed behind me and someone's car alarm chirped in the distance. For a moment, I didn't move. I replayed the message once, then again, because something inside me needed to hear the words clearly enough to stop pretending. The truth was, my family hadn't suddenly rejected me. They had simply said out loud what they had been practicing for years. I was valuable when I fixed their problems. I was welcome when I solved their emergencies. I was appreciated when I quietly cleaned up messes they didn't want anyone else to see. But the moment I stopped being useful, I became disposable. So I did the simplest thing possible. I texted my mother back a single word. Understood. That one word quietly started the chain reaction that would unravel everything they believed they had under control. Before I explain how things collapsed so quickly, tell me something. What time is it where you're watching this from? And what city are you in? I always find it fascinating how stories like this travel across the world and somehow land exactly where someone else has lived through something similar. Because if you've ever been the person in your family who fixes everything, the one everyone calls when something breaks, then you probably know how this kind of story begins. My parents thought they were cutting off the difficult daughter. What they actually cut off was the person holding together the fragile structure beneath their entire lifestyle. And once that structure disappeared, the panic came faster than any of us expected. My job has never been glamorous. I work in regulatory compliance for private medical foundations, which basically means I spend my career tracing where money is supposed to go, where it actually goes, and what happens when people assume nobody is paying attention. It's tedious work, full of paperwork, legal language, and uncomfortable questions, but it teaches you something important. Systems only look stable when the right people are quietly maintaining them. My family never respected what I did for a living. They used to joke that I was the boring one, the rule follower, the person who cared too much about contracts and deadlines. But over time, they learned something else about my job. It was very good at fixing their mistakes. For nearly 7 years, I became the person who untangled their financial problems. I reviewed documents they didn't understand. I explained loan agreements they had already signed. I reorganized payment schedules that were about to collapse. Every time a crisis appeared, the pattern was the same. My parents would panic, my sister would cry, and eventually someone would call me. At first I told myself it was temporary. Families help each other, right? But temporary slowly turned into routine, and routine turned into expectation. By the time I realized what was happening, I had quietly become the safety net beneath every bad decision they made. The situation that triggered everything had been building for months. My parents had spent the entire summer telling their friends about a major life change. They were selling the old family house and moving into a luxury townhouse downtown near the waterfront. They described it as a fresh start, a new chapter, the reward for years of hard work. On social media, it looked perfect. What nobody knew was that the entire transaction depended on a fragile sequence of financial approvals and documentation. The kind of complex administrative chain that most people ignore until something goes wrong. I had agreed, against my better judgment, to help oversee the verification process for the deal. Not ownership, not control, just the administrative oversight needed to confirm the legitimacy of the funds involved in the transfer. It was the kind of quiet responsibility that keeps large transactions from collapsing. Until the moment my mother sent that voicemail, I had been the person making sure everything stayed stable. The next morning at 7:30 a.m., I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open and a cup of coffee slowly going cold beside me. My mother's words kept echoing in my head. "We're moving forward without you." So, I did exactly what a professional does when someone terminates a working relationship. I withdrew my involvement.
Calmly.
Quietly.
Completely.
I emailed the transaction coordinator to inform her that I was no longer participating in document verification. I notified the financial broker that my authorization to communicate on the property transaction had been revoked. Then I flagged the shared document portal for identity revalidation, which meant all access tied to my credentials would temporarily suspend until new verification was completed. There was no argument, no dramatic announcement, no revenge speech. Just a few polite emails removing my name from a system that had only functioned because I was inside it. After sending the messages, I closed my laptop and went to work. What I didn't expect was how quickly the consequences would start showing up. By 10:15 that morning, my phone rang for the first time. I let it ring. 10 minutes later it rang again. Then again. And again. It's strange how quickly "don't contact us again" turns into "why aren't you answering?" The first voicemail came from my father. He tried to sound calm, but there was a tightness in his voice that gave him away. He said there seemed to be confusion with the paperwork for the property transfer and asked me to call him back. 20 minutes later, he called again, and this time the calm tone had disappeared. The broker had informed him that authorizations were missing from the documentation chain. By mid-afternoon, the messages had become urgent. "You need to fix this today," he said in the third voicemail. But the message that made my stomach drop didn't come from my father or my mother. It came from an assisted living coordinator. And that was the moment I realized something far bigger was happening behind the scenes. Something my family had never mentioned to me. Something involving my grandmother and a financial promise that was about to collapse. The message from the assisted living coordinator arrived just after 4 in the afternoon while I was finishing a compliance report at my desk. At first, I assumed it had been sent to me by mistake. The subject line read, "Verification of financial arrangement." The email itself was polite, carefully worded, and professional in the way organizations tend to be when they're asking questions they're not entirely comfortable asking. The coordinator introduced herself as someone from a private residence facility and explained that she was following up regarding a suite reservation that had recently been discussed for my grandmother. She said they were simply confirming that the funding structure previously described by the family was still valid before moving forward with final paperwork. I read the message once quickly, then again more slowly because something about it didn't make sense. My grandmother hadn't mentioned any move. In fact, the last time we spoke, she was still living comfortably in the small house she'd owned for decades. The email went on to explain that the deposit for the residence was expected to come from proceeds tied to my parents' upcoming property transaction. That was the moment my stomach tightened, because suddenly the entire chain connected itself in my head. The new townhouse my parents had been bragging about. The rushed sale of the old family house. The financial verification I had been overseeing. And now, apparently, a luxury assisted living suite they had already promised my grandmother. It was like looking at a row of dominoes that someone had stacked too quickly without checking if the table underneath them was stable. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen for a long moment, realizing that none of this had ever been explained to me directly. My parents had presented the move as a simple lifestyle upgrade, the kind of transition people their age make when they want less maintenance and more comfort. But now it looked like something else entirely. They weren't just moving themselves. They had already started building a whole narrative around taking care of my grandmother, probably telling friends and acquaintances how generous and responsible they were for planning her future. What they hadn't told anyone, at least not honestly, was that the entire arrangement depended on money that didn't actually exist yet. I opened the attachment included with the email. It was a preliminary agreement form for the assisted living residence, outlining the deposit amount and the projected monthly costs. The numbers were staggering. Whoever had chosen that place hadn't been thinking about modest comfort or practical care. They had chosen somewhere that looked impressive. Somewhere with marble floors in the lobby and landscape gardens and concierge services. The kind of place people liked to mention casually in conversations so others would assume they were doing extremely well. My grandmother had always been practical, the type of woman who thought fancy things were a waste of money. Seeing her name attached to a residence like that felt wrong, like someone had dressed her in clothes that didn't belong to her. And then another realization settled in. If the deposit for that facility was supposed to come from the townhouse deal, and the townhouse deal depended on the sale of the old house, and the sale of the old house depended on documentation that I had just removed myself from, then the entire structure was now hanging by a thread. I closed the email without replying and looked at my phone. It had been lighting up all afternoon. By that point, there were more than 20 missed calls and several text messages waiting for me. Most of them came from my parents, but a few were from my sister. I hadn't opened any of them yet. Something about the tone of the voicemails earlier had already told me what I would find. Panic disguised as accusation. Blame wrapped in urgency. I finally unlocked the screen and opened the family group chat that had been silent for weeks until that morning. The first message from my sister read, "What did you do?"
No greeting.
No question about whether something had happened. Just accusation. The next message came a few minutes later. "Mom says the broker told him you removed your authorization. Why would you do that right now?" Then another message appeared underneath. "Do you realize the damage this could cause?" I stared at the screen for a few seconds before setting the phone back down on the desk. It was strange how predictable the pattern was. Something went wrong in the family, and the assumption immediately became that I was responsible. Not because I had actually done something harmful, but because I had stopped fixing something they had already broken. It was the same logic they had used for years. Their choices became my responsibility the moment consequences appeared. My phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't from my parents or my sister. It was an unknown number. I let it ring, assuming it was another broker or contractor connected to the property transaction. When the call ended, a voicemail notification appeared almost instantly. I hesitated for a moment before pressing play. A man's voice introduced himself as a legal representative working with my parents on the property sale. His tone was polite but tight, the way professionals sound when they're trying to stay calm in the middle of someone else's problem. He explained that there appeared to be a complication involving the verification process tied to the transaction. Apparently, several parties were now requesting updated confirmation regarding the financial documentation chain, and without that confirmation, the closing timeline might need to be delayed. Delayed. That one word carried far more weight than it seemed to. Because in deals like the one my parents had set up, timing was everything. Buyers had expectations. Sellers had deadlines. Contractors scheduled work weeks in advance. If one piece of the chain slipped, the rest of the schedule could unravel quickly. I played the message again and leaned back in my chair. What fascinated me most wasn't the fact that everything was suddenly stalling. It was how quickly the tone had changed. Less than 24 hours earlier, my mother had told me not to contact the family again. She had sounded confident, almost relieved, like she had finally rid herself of an inconvenience. But now the systems that depended on my involvement were starting to falter, and suddenly everyone wanted to talk. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so familiar. For years, I had watched my parents build their lives on optimism instead of reality. They liked to believe that things would somehow work out if they pushed forward confidently enough. And most of the time, they had been right because I had been quietly correcting the math behind the scenes. But this time was different, because this time they had removed the one person who knew how fragile the entire arrangement really was. I closed my laptop and packed my bag to leave work for the day. As I walked toward the elevator, my phone vibrated again. Another voicemail from my father appeared on the screen, and this one sounded nothing like the calm man I had grown up with. His voice was tense and rushed, like someone who had just realized the ground beneath him wasn't as solid as he thought. "Lena, you need to call us back," he said. "There's been a misunderstanding with the paperwork. The title company says there's a hold on the file and we can't move forward until it's cleared. Whatever you did, we need to fix it tonight." I stood there in the empty hallway outside the elevator listening to his words. Whatever you did. Not what happened. Not why did you withdraw. Just the assumption that the problem existed because of me. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and stepped into the elevator as the doors opened. Because the truth was, the real problem hadn't started with my emails that morning. The real problem had started long before that, when my parents began making promises to other people based on a system they never actually understood. And by the time they realized how much of that system depended on me, it was already too late. By the time I got home that evening, the missed calls had climbed past 30. My phone buzzed every few minutes like it had developed a nervous habit. Messages from my parents, from my sister, from numbers I didn't recognize. I set the phone on the kitchen counter and let it vibrate while I poured myself a glass of water. It's strange how quickly urgency appears when a system stops working the way people expect. 24 hours earlier, my mother had confidently told me not to contact them again. Now my silence was apparently a crisis. When I finally opened the messages, the tone had shifted from confusion to accusation. My sister's text came first. "Mom is humiliated right now. The broker says you caused the delay. Do you even understand how serious this is?" Reading them felt like stepping into a script I had seen too many times before. Their decisions somehow turned into my fault the moment consequences showed up. I almost responded, but another email notification appeared before I could type anything. This one came from the title coordinator, handling the house sale. Her message was short but careful. She explained that several verification steps tied to the transaction were now incomplete due to the removal of my authorization from the documentation chain. Without those confirmations, the buyer's legal team had requested additional due diligence before continuing. In simple terms, the deal had stalled. I read the email twice, not with satisfaction, but with the calm clarity that comes when a pattern finally makes sense. For years, my parents had relied on me to stabilize situations they barely understood. They assumed the structure would continue working even if they removed the person maintaining it. The phone rang again while I stood there reading. This time I answered without looking at the number. My father's voice came through immediately, strained and impatient. He skipped greetings entirely. "Lena, what exactly did you do this morning?" The question sounded less like curiosity and more like an accusation. I leaned against the counter and answered as calmly as I could. "I withdrew from the transaction after Mom told me not to contact the family again." There was a silence on the other end of the line that lasted long enough to feel uncomfortable. Then he exhaled sharply. That voicemail was sent in frustration. It wasn't meant to interfere with business matters. Business matters. The phrase hung in the air between us like a translation error. Because what he meant was something much simpler. They had expected me to keep helping even after they pushed me away. He tried explaining the situation in fragments. The buyer's side had suddenly demanded updated verification. The broker couldn't proceed without confirmation from someone with the appropriate oversight authority. Contractors working on the old house were asking questions about deposit transfers. Every sentence revealed another part of the structure my parents had built around assumptions. They had promised timelines to people who now expected results. They had spoken confidently about funds that technically existed only if every step in the process worked perfectly. And suddenly those steps were missing. When he finished, he asked the question that had been hovering behind the entire conversation. "Can you just restore the authorization so we can finish this?" The way he said it made the request sound simple, almost routine, like flipping a switch. I closed my eyes for a moment before answering. "No," I said quietly. "You told me not to be involved anymore. I respected that." His frustration spilled out immediately after that. He said I was overreacting. He said the situation required cooperation. He said families help each other during stressful moments. Listening to him list those expectations felt strangely distant, as if I were hearing the echo of a role I had already stepped out of. When the call ended, my phone buzzed again, almost instantly. This time the message came from my mother, and the words she wrote changed everything. The text message from my mother was only one sentence long, but it carried the same sharp precision she had always used when she wanted to wound someone quietly. "I hope you're proud of humiliating your own family." I stared at the screen for a long moment before setting the phone down again. What struck me most about the message wasn't the anger. It was the choice of words. Not damaging the deal. Not complicating the situation. Humiliating the family. That was the center of my mother's world. Reputation first. Reality second.
It had always been that way.
2 days later, I learned just how far that reputation had already spread. A mutual acquaintance forwarded me an invitation for a charity reception my mother had been organizing for months. The event was scheduled to take place at a historic conservatory downtown, a beautiful glass building used for donor events and fundraising dinners. Normally, I wouldn't have paid much attention to something like that, but the message attached to the invitation made me pause. The acquaintance had written a short note underneath the file. "You might want to know how your name is being mentioned." I opened the document slowly. The invitation itself looked polished and elegant, full of phrases about community support and dignified elder care. But the real story appeared in the description of the event host. My mother had introduced herself to donors as someone managing the complex responsibility of relocating her elderly mother while navigating the painful estrangement of a daughter who had chosen resentment over family duty. Reading that line felt like stepping into a conversation I had never agreed to join. She wasn't just angry at me privately. She was rewriting the narrative publicly, framing herself as the victim of a difficult child who had abandoned the family during a crisis. For a long time I sat there staring at the words. The anger I expected never arrived. Instead, there was a strange kind of calm clarity. If she was going to tell a story about me in rooms full of influential people, then perhaps it was time I heard that story myself. So, I decided to attend the reception. Not to create a scene. Not to confront her dramatically. Just to listen. The conservatory was glowing with warm light when I arrived that evening. Donors mingled among tables covered with white linen and polished glassware. Conversations floated through the room in soft bursts of laughter and polite curiosity. I spotted my mother almost immediately. She stood near the center of the room speaking with a group of guests, smiling with the effortless warmth she always displayed when an audience was present. For a moment I watched from across the room, realizing how easily she could move between versions of herself depending on who was watching. Then her eyes found me. The smile froze on her face for a fraction of a second before she excused herself from the group and walked quickly toward me. "Why are you here?" she whispered when she reached me. Her voice was calm, but the tension in her expression told a different story. I answered quietly. "I heard my name was part of the evening." Her eyes narrowed slightly. She tried guiding me toward a hallway away from the crowd, but the sudden movement had already drawn attention from nearby guests. When she realized people were watching, she changed tactics instantly. Her voice lifted just enough to sound wounded. "Lena, this isn't the time for family drama." The sentence was carefully chosen. It framed the situation before anyone else could ask questions. I looked at her and spoke softly. "You made it the time when you told people a story about me that wasn't true." A few nearby guests turned in our direction at the change in tone. My mother's smile tightened as she realized the conversation was no longer private. And in that moment, the version of events she had been presenting to everyone around her began to crack. What happened next wasn't loud or dramatic the way people imagine confrontations to be. It unfolded quietly, through questions rather than accusations. A board member who had been standing nearby asked whether there had been confusion about the family's relocation plans. Another donor asked how the property transition was progressing. Each question seemed harmless on its own, but together they formed a spotlight my parents couldn't easily step out of. I answered only when someone asked me directly. I explained that I had withdrawn from involvement in the transaction after being told not to contact the family anymore. I mentioned the written notices confirming that withdrawal. I said nothing about emotions or personal conflicts.
Just facts.
But facts have a way of shifting the atmosphere in a room very quickly. Within minutes, the conversation had moved from polite curiosity to cautious concern. Someone from the charity's legal advisory group quietly asked my mother whether financial commitments connected to the relocation had been finalized yet. My father looked pale as he stood near the edge of the group, clearly realizing how quickly the narrative was unraveling. My sister tried to smooth things over by insisting there had simply been a misunderstanding, but by that point the questions were no longer directed at me. They were directed at my parents. I didn't stay long after that. The moment had already done what it needed to do. As I walked toward the exit, a man approached me near the coat check. He introduced himself as the attorney representing my parents in the property transaction. His voice carried none of the confidence it had earlier in the week. He asked if we could speak privately about resolving the situation before it escalated further. I told him calmly that I had no interest in escalating anything. My only goal was to ensure that my name was no longer connected to decisions I wasn't involved in. He nodded slowly, clearly realizing that the damage wasn't coming from anything I had said. It was coming from the gap between what my parents had promised and what reality could actually support. The fallout took several weeks to fully unfold. Without verified documentation, the buyer for the old family house withdrew from the deal. The townhouse my parents had hoped to purchase went to another buyer with cleaner financing. The assisted living residents quietly canceled the reservation once the deposit couldn't be secured. One by one, the plans my parents had presented to everyone around them dissolved under closer inspection. For the first time in years, their decisions were standing on their own, without someone quietly stabilizing them behind the scenes. My grandmother's situation was the only part one couldn't ignore. Through a social worker friend, I helped arrange a modest and reputable care facility for her, one that focused on genuine support instead of luxury appearances. It wasn't the grand residence my mother had been describing to donors, but it was safe, affordable, and honest. My grandmother settled in comfortably within a few weeks. My parents weren't grateful for that solution. My mother called me furious, accusing me of embarrassing the family by choosing a facility that didn't match the image she had presented publicly. That word again, image. Hearing it finally confirmed something I had suspected for years. The life my parents cared about most existed in other people's perceptions, not in the reality underneath. Eventually, my father asked to meet in person. We sat across from each other at the dining table in the half-packed house they had once planned to sell for a fortune. For a while he talked about stress and misunderstandings and how things had spiraled out of control. When he finished, he asked quietly if there was any way to repair the situation. I looked at him for a long time before answering. "There's nothing to repair," I said. "You told me to step away, and I did." The silence that followed felt heavy, but strangely peaceful. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't carrying the responsibility for holding their world together. A few months later, I signed the paperwork for a small condo of my own.
No dramatic announcements.
No family involvement. Just a quiet closing appointment and a set of keys that represented something I had never fully allowed myself before. Independence, without obligation. Sometimes people think revenge looks like shouting or public humiliation. But in my experience, the most powerful response is much simpler. It's stepping out of a role you were never meant to carry forever, and letting the people who relied on that role finally face the life they built without it.